The night was unusually quiet in the suburban neighborhood of Peachtree Hills, Georgia. The air carried a cool breeze, and the streets were dimly lit by flickering lampposts. Officer Michael Dawson sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as his K-9 partner, Zeus, rested alertly beside him. Zeus was no ordinary dog. He was trained to protect, to sniff out danger, and to act swiftly when needed. Together, they had built a reputation for being one of the most effective teams on the force. But tonight, something felt different. A call came over the radio, a report of a possible break-in at a luxury home on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Michael grabbed the mic and confirmed he was en route. His heart pounded as he drove through the winding roads, the headlights cutting through the darkness. He knew this area well. It was filled with sprawling mansions owned by some of the town's wealthiest residents. Still, he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. When Michael arrived at the address, the house looked eerily silent. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or open doors, just an expensive property surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and a tall iron gate. As he stepped out of the car, Zeus immediately went on high alert, his ears perked and muscles tense. Michael gave the command to search the perimeter, and together they moved cautiously toward the front door. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside the house. Someone was coming outside. Michael drew his flashlight and shouted, "Police! Come out slowly with your hands visible." The door creaked open, and a figure emerged into the soft glow of the porch light. It was a tall man, wearing casual clothes but carrying himself with authority. He held a baseball bat in one hand, clearly startled by the unexpected visitors. "I'm calling the police," the man said firmly, his voice calm yet commanding. "Who are you?" Michael froze for a split second. This wasn't what he had expected. Before he could respond, Zeus lunged forward, barking fiercely. The man raised the bat instinctively, and in that moment, everything spiraled out of control. Zeus attacked, biting down hard on the man's arm. Michael yelled for him to stop, pulling desperately at the leash, but it was too late. The man fell to the ground, struggling to fight back as blood seeped onto the pavement. It took several agonizing minutes for Michael to regain control of Zeus. By then, the man lay motionless, his breathing shallow. Panic set in as Michael called for backup and medical assistance. He knelt beside the injured man, trying to keep him conscious. That's when he noticed the insignia on the man's shirt, a U.S. Army emblem. A sinking feeling hit him like a ton of bricks. Who was this man? And why hadn't he identified himself earlier? By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The man, later identified as retired U.S. Army General Marcus Holloway, had succumbed to his injuries. News of the incident spread quickly, igniting outrage across the community. For Michael, the weight of what had happened crushed him. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over again, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently. Little did he know, this tragedy would set off a chain reaction that would change not only his life, but also the lives of those connected to General Holloway, including his grieving daughter, Jasmine, whose pursuit of justice would uncover secrets far greater than anyone anticipated. The death of General Marcus Holloway sent shockwaves through the nation, igniting a firestorm of anger and grief. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, painting the retired Army general as not just a victim, but a symbol of integrity and resilience. Pictures of him in full military regalia, medals gleaming on his chest, dominated television screens and social media feeds. His legacy as a decorated war hero and advocate for racial justice made the tragedy even more devastating. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for General Holloway," and "Enough is enough." The air buzzed with chants demanding accountability. For Officer Michael Dawson, the days following the incident were a blur of guilt, fear, and isolation. Placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, he found himself trapped in a nightmare. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every phone call felt like it might bring bad news. His wife, Sarah, tried to console him, reminding him that accidents happen, but her words offered little comfort. At night, Michael lay awake replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of General Holloway falling to the ground, nor the sound of his own voice shouting for Zeus to stop, an order that came too late. Meanwhile, Jasmine Holloway returned to Georgia from Washington, D.C., where she worked as a junior analyst at the FBI. Her father's death hit her like a freight train. She had always admired him, not just as a parent, but as a role model who stood up for what was right. Losing him so suddenly left a gaping hole in her life. But grief quickly gave way to determination. Jasmine wasn't one to sit back and let others dictate the narrative. She wanted answers, and she intended to get them. Jasmine began digging into the details of the case, combing through police reports, body cam footage, and witness statements. What she uncovered only fueled her outrage. Complaints against Michael Dawson surfaced, allegations of excessive force, questionable tactics, and even whispers of racial profiling. It seemed this wasn't the first time someone had accused him of crossing the line. Each piece of evidence deepened her resolve to hold him accountable. But as she delved deeper, something unexpected caught her attention. Vague references to corruption within Michael's precinct. Names popped up repeatedly, hinting at a web of misconduct that stretched far beyond one officer or one dog. The media frenzy surrounding the case added another layer of complexity. Reporters camped outside Jasmine's family home, desperate for quotes or glimpses of the grieving daughter. Some portrayed her as a crusader for justice, while others questioned whether her pursuit stemmed from personal vendettas. Online forums exploded with debates about systemic racism, police brutality, and the use of K-9 units. Opinions clashed fiercely, dividing communities and sparking heated arguments across dinner tables and comment sections alike. Amid the chaos, Jasmine received a call from someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her estranged father, Victor Langston, a former FBI agent turned private investigator. Victor had been largely absent from her life after splitting with her mother when she was young. His tone was cautious yet urgent. "Jasmine," he said, "you need to be careful. This isn't just about one cop or one dog. There's more going on here than meets the eye." At first, Jasmine bristled at the intrusion. She didn't want advice from a man she barely knew. But curiosity got the better of her. When they finally met face to face, Victor revealed fragments of information that stopped her cold. Decades ago, he had investigated the same precinct where Michael worked, uncovering ties to corruption and abuse of power. Yet his efforts mysteriously stalled, leaving the case unresolved. Now, seeing his estranged daughter thrust into the middle of a similar fight, Victor couldn't stay silent any longer. As protests continued and tensions mounted, Jasmine realized this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about avenging her father's death. It was about exposing a system riddled with flaws and biases. With Victor's help, she vowed to dig deeper, determined to shine a light on the truth. Little did she know, the journey ahead would unearth secrets that reached far beyond anything she could have imagined. Jasmine Holloway spent her days buried in research, piecing together fragments of information like a puzzle. Her small apartment became a makeshift command center, with stacks of documents, sticky notes, and screenshots spread across every available surface. She barely slept, driven by an unrelenting need to uncover the truth about her father's death. The more she dug, the clearer it became that Michael Dawson wasn't the only problem. His actions were part of something much larger. Her investigation led her to old police reports filed against Dawson and other officers in his precinct. There were accounts of aggressive stops, unnecessary use of force, and troubling patterns of behavior that disproportionately affected black residents in their community. One complaint stood out. A young man named Jamal Carter claimed he had been stopped without cause, thrown to the ground, and bitten by Zeus during what should have been a routine traffic check. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence, But Jamal's testimony painted a chilling picture of how easily power could spiral out of control. As Jasmine sifted through these records, another name kept appearing: Agent Victor Langston, her father. His involvement in past investigations into the precincts surprised her at first, but soon pieces began falling into place. Decades earlier, Victor had been assigned to look into allegations of corruption within the department. He uncovered disturbing connections between certain officers and local crime syndicates, as well as evidence suggesting systemic misconduct went unchecked for years. But then, abruptly, his investigation ended. No arrests were made, no charges filed. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire operation. Curiosity turned to frustration as Jasmine realized just how close Victor had come to exposing the truth, and how far those responsible had gone to silence him. She confronted him one evening over video call, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why didn't you finish what you started?" she demanded. "You were so close. If you'd done your job back then, maybe Dad wouldn't be dead today." Victor sighed heavily, his weathered face etched with regret. "It's not that simple, Jasmine," he said. "I hit a wall I couldn't break through. People above me shut things down. Threats were made, not just to me, but to your mom and you. I thought walking away would keep us safe." His admission stung, but it also ignited a spark of understanding in Jasmine. For the first time, she saw her father not as the distant figure who abandoned them, but as a man caught in a web of impossible choices. Determined to pick up where Victor left off, Jasmine reached out to whistleblowers from the precinct. Many were hesitant to speak, fearing retaliation, but a few agreed to meet secretly. One former officer, Rachel Morales, shared shocking details about internal cover-ups and pressure to falsify reports. "They don't want anyone asking questions," Rachel warned. "If they find out you're poking around, they'll come after you too." The deeper Jasmine went, the more dangerous the situation became. Late one night, as she reviewed classified files Victor had sent her, she noticed something strange: a series of redacted names linked to high-profile military contracts. Among them was General Marcus Holloway. At first, she couldn't believe it. Why would her father's name appear in documents tied to corruption? Then it dawned on her. Perhaps his advocacy work had put him in the crosshairs of powerful people who didn't want change. Sleep eluded Jasmine as paranoia crept in. She started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near her building and shadowy figures lingering outside coffee shops where she met sources. Was she being followed? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? Either way, the stakes felt higher than ever. Every discovery brought her closer to answers, but also closer to danger. Despite the risks, Jasmine refused to back down. With each new revelation, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about justice for her father anymore. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that had claimed too many lives. As she stared at the growing pile of evidence on her table, Jasmine whispered a promise to herself and to her father. "I won't let them win. Not this time." Jasmine's relationship with her father, Victor Langston, had always been strained at best. Growing up, she remembered him as a distant figure, someone who disappeared for weeks on end, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves. When he finally left their lives altogether after the divorce, Jasmine convinced herself she didn't need him. But now, sitting across from him in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, she couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and curiosity bubbling inside her. Victor looked older than she remembered, his once strong frame now slightly stooped, his face lined with years of stress and regret. He carried himself cautiously, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes as if expecting someone to burst through the door. Despite his guarded demeanor, there was an urgency in his voice that caught Jasmine off guard. "You're playing with fire," he said, leaning forward. "These people don't care about rules or laws. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Jasmine clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her emotions in check. "And you should know all about that, right?" She shot back, her tone sharp. "You walked away when things got tough. You left me and Mom. And now look where we are." Victor flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a folder filled with documents. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quietly, "but I am asking you to listen. If you're going to take this fight to them, you need to understand what you're up against." The papers detailed connections between Michael Dawson's precinct and a network of corrupt officials, contractors, and even members of the military. Names jumped out at Jasmine, some familiar, others completely unknown. What shocked her most was the mention of General Marcus Holloway. According to the files, her father had uncovered evidence of embezzlement tied to defense contracts meant to support veterans. His efforts to expose the scheme had put him directly in the crosshairs of powerful enemies. Victor explained how he had tried to intervene years ago, only to be silenced by threats against his family. "They made it clear. If I kept digging, they'd come after you and your mom," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I thought walking away would keep you safe. I was wrong." For a moment, Jasmine sat in silence, processing everything. Part of her wanted to lash out, to accuse Victor of being selfish and cowardly. But another part of her, a quieter, more rational voice, recognized the weight of his sacrifice. Whether she liked it or not, they were bound together by this fight now. As the hours passed, father and daughter began working side by side, combing through the documents and piecing together a timeline of events. Their interactions were awkward at first, filled with long pauses and unspoken tension. But slowly, they found a rhythm. Victor shared tips on how to decode redacted files, while Jasmine brought fresh energy and determination to the investigation. Together, they uncovered leads pointing to a shadowy figure known only as the broker, who seemed to orchestrate much of the corruption behind the scenes. Despite their progress, danger loomed closer with each passing day. One evening, as they left the diner, Jasmine noticed a black SUV parked down the street. Its engine idled ominously, headlights off. She tugged at Victor's sleeve, urging him to hurry to their car. Neither spoke until they were safely inside, doors locked. "This is getting too risky," Victor muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Maybe you should step back before." "No," Jasmine interrupted firmly. "I'm not backing down. Not now." Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror, unwavering. For the first time in years, Victor saw glimpses of the strong, fearless woman she had become, and though fear still gnawed at him, he nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said, "but promise me one thing. We stick together. No more running. No more hiding." Jasmine hesitated, then gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As they drove off into the night, the road ahead uncertain and fraught with peril, Jasmine felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she and Victor could rewrite their story, not as victims, but as fighters determined to bring justice to those who had none. The days turned into weeks, and Michael Dawson found himself trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The walls of his small cell felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him with guilt and regret. Zeus, his loyal K-9 partner, had been taken away immediately after the incident, and the absence of the dog, who had always been his constant companion, left an unbearable void. Michael spent sleepless nights replaying the events that led to General Marcus Holloway's death, questioning every decision he'd made that night. What if he had approached the situation differently? What if he had called for backup sooner? The questions haunted him relentlessly. Visits from his wife, Sarah, were both a comfort and a torment. She tried her best to reassure him, telling him that accidents happen and that he wasn't a bad person. But Michael could see the strain in her eyes, the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on their family. Their young son, Ethan, didn't fully understand what was happening, but even he sensed the tension at home. During one visit, Ethan asked innocently, "Daddy, when are you coming back?" The question broke Michael's heart, leaving him unable to respond. As the trial loomed closer, Michael's attorney urged him to cooperate fully with investigators. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said firmly. It's about exposing the bigger issues within your department. If you testify against the corruption, it might not erase what happened, but it could help prevent it from happening again. At first, Michael resisted. Testifying meant turning on colleagues he had worked alongside for years, people he once considered friends. But as he reflected on his career, the complaints, the questionable orders, the times he looked the other way, he realized how complicit he had been in a broken system. One evening, during a meeting with his lawyer, Michael broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted his failures, not just on the night of the incident, but throughout his career. He confessed to moments when he ignored signs of misconduct, afraid of rocking the boat or jeopardizing his position. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong," he whispered hoarsely. "But now I see how blind I was." His decision to cooperate came with risks. Word spread quickly among his former colleagues, some of whom viewed him as a traitor. Threats arrived in the form of anonymous letters slipped under his cell door, warning him to stay silent. Yet, despite the fear, Michael felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he was taking responsibility, not just for General Holloway's death, but for his role in perpetuating a flawed system. Zeus, meanwhile, struggled in his new environment. Separated from Michael, the dog exhibited signs of distress, refusing to eat and growling at handlers who tried to approach him. Animal behaviorists noted that Zeus's actions mirrored Michael's emotional state, a reflection of the bond they shared. News of the dog's condition reached Michael, adding another layer of grief to his already heavy burden. He wrote letters to Zeus, though he knew the dog would never read them, pouring out apologies and promises to make things right if given the chance. Public opinion remained divided. Some saw Michael as a scapegoat, arguing that the real culprits were the corrupt officials who created the toxic environment in which such tragedies occurred. Others viewed him as a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement, calling for harsh punishment. Amid the chaos, Michael focused on one goal: redemption. He began working with prison counselors, sharing his experiences, and advocating for reform among fellow inmates. His efforts earned him cautious respect, though trust was hard to come by. When the court date was finally set, Michael prepared himself for the hardest battle of his life. He knew testifying would mean exposing painful truths, not only about himself, but also about the institution he had served. Yet, deep down, he believed it was the only way forward. As he sat in his cell the night before the trial, staring at the ceiling, he whispered a silent apology to General Holloway. "I can't bring you back," he said softly. "But I swear, I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and consequences. But for the first time since that fateful night, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Not for forgiveness, but for change. And perhaps in time, that would be enough. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces representing every side of the debate. Protesters lined the streets outside, holding signs that read "Justice for General Holloway" and "Reform Now." Inside, reporters jostled for seats, cameras flashing as lawyers, witnesses, and family members filed in. The air buzzed with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. For Jasmine Holloway, sitting just a few rows behind the prosecution's table, it felt like the weight of the nation rested on this trial. She clutched her father's old army cap in her hands, drawing strength from its worn fabric. Michael Dawson entered the room flanked by guards, his head bowed. He looked smaller than he had in the news footage, his face pale and drawn. As he took his seat, their eyes briefly met across the crowded space. Jasmine felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Was it pity? She quickly looked away, focusing instead on the task at hand, ensuring the truth came to light. The prosecution painted Michael as a symbol of systemic failure, presenting evidence of past complaints, questionable tactics, and the culture of impunity within his precinct. They called witnesses who recounted harrowing stories of encounters with officers like Michael, each account adding another brick to the wall of public outrage. Then came Jasmine herself, stepping up to the stand with quiet determination. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about her father, the man he was, the legacy he left behind, it grew stronger. "My father dedicated his life to protecting others," she said, her words echoing through the silent courtroom. "He didn't deserve to die because of fear, bias, and unchecked power." When it was Michael's turn to testify, the atmosphere shifted. His attorney guided him carefully, allowing him to take responsibility for his actions while exposing the cracks in the system that had shaped him. Michael spoke haltingly, his voice breaking as he described the night of the incident. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, looking directly at Jasmine for the first time. "I failed, not just your father, but everyone who trusted me to protect them. And I'm so sorry." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some sympathetic, others dismissive. But Jasmine sat frozen, her heart pounding. Hearing those words didn't erase the pain, but they struck a chord deep inside her. For the first time, she saw Michael not as a villain, but as a flawed human being caught in a cycle of corruption far bigger than himself. It was a complicated realization, one she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. Victor Langston also took the stand, delivering damning testimony about the corruption he had uncovered decades ago. His revelations sent shockwaves through the room, implicating high-ranking officials and tying the tragedy to a web of greed and abuse. When asked why he hadn't pursued justice back then, Victor's answer was simple yet heartbreaking. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, "afraid of what they'd do to my family. But I see now that silence only makes things worse." As the days wore on, the trial became less about Michael and more about the larger issues plaguing law enforcement. Activists rallied outside, using the case as a rallying cry for reform. Lawyers debated passionately, jurors listened intently, and the media dissected every detail. Yet amidst the chaos, small moments of humanity emerge. One day, after a particularly grueling session, Jasmine found herself standing near Michael in the hallway. Neither spoke at first, but finally, Michael broke the silence. "I know there's nothing I can say to fix this," he began hesitantly. "But if you ever want answers, or even just someone to yell at, I'll be here." Jasmine stared at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She nodded once, unsure of what to say, and walked away. That brief exchange stayed with her long after the day ended, planting seeds of doubt in her black and white view of justice. Maybe revenge wasn't the only path forward. Maybe healing required something harder: understanding. By the time closing arguments rolled around, emotions ran high. The prosecution urged the jury to hold Michael accountable, emphasizing the need for change. The defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Michael was a product of a broken system trying to make amends. As the judge instructed the jury to deliberate, the courtroom held its breath, waiting to see whether justice, or compromise, would prevail. Whatever the verdict, one thing was clear: this case would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. The jury's verdict came after 3 tense days of deliberation, and when the foreman stood to deliver it, the courtroom fell so silent you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Michael Dawson sat upright in his chair, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the table. Jasmine Holloway leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly together, while Victor Langston watched with a guarded expression, his years of experience telling him that justice often came in shades of gray rather than black and white. "On the charge of involuntary manslaughter," the foreman announced, pausing just long enough to make everyone's hearts skip a beat, "we find the defendant guilty." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some nodded in approval, others shook their heads in disappointment. But before anyone could react fully, the foreman continued, "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The split decision landed like a thunderclap. For Michael, relief mingled with guilt. He would avoid prison time for murder, but still faced consequences for his actions. For Jasmine, the verdict felt incomplete. It wasn't the sweeping accountability she had hoped for, but neither was it a total exoneration of Michael or the system he represented. As the judge sentenced Michael to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole, she looked down at her father's army cap, tracing its brim with trembling fingers. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like closure. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine threw herself into advocacy work, channeling her grief and frustration into action. She organized community forums, inviting former officers turned whistleblowers, activists, and even Victor to speak alongside her. These events drew crowds of all ages and backgrounds, united by a shared desire for change. At one forum, Michael appeared via video call from prison, his voice steady as he apologized again and urged other officers to confront the flaws within their ranks. His words sparked heated debates but also opened doors to difficult conversations about reform. Victor, too, began stepping out of the shadows, using his expertise to mentor young investigators eager to root out corruption. Though their relationship remained complicated, Jasmine found herself leaning on him more often, not as a hero, but as an ally in a fight much bigger than either of them. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, built not on forgiveness, but on mutual respect and purpose. Meanwhile, Michael adjusted to life behind bars, finding solace in mentoring fellow inmates and writing letters to Zeus, who had been adopted by a handler specializing in rehabilitating troubled K-9. Reports indicated that Zeus was slowly recovering, responding well to training designed to rebuild trust. Knowing this gave Michael hope, a reminder that healing, however slow, was possible. Public opinion remained divided. Some praised the trial as a step toward accountability. Others criticized it as proof that systemic issues persisted unchecked. Yet amid the noise, small victories emerged. The precinct where Michael had worked launched internal reforms, including stricter oversight of K-9 units and mandatory de-escalation training. Activists celebrated these changes cautiously, knowing they were only the beginning of a long journey. For Jasmine, the turning point came during a private visit to the prison. Sitting across from Michael in a stark visiting room, she finally voiced what had been weighing on her mind. "I don't think I'll ever forgive you," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "But I believe you're trying to make things right. And maybe that's enough for now." Michael nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That means more than you know." As Jasmine walked away from the prison that day, she realized something profound. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about progress. Healing wouldn't come overnight, but with every step forward, no matter how small, the world became a little less broken. And sometimes, that was enough. Months after the trial, life began to settle into a fragile rhythm for everyone involved. The scars of the tragedy still lingered, but small signs of hope started to emerge, like rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For Jasmine Holloway, the pain of losing her father remained sharp, yet she found purpose in channeling her grief into action. Her advocacy work gained momentum, drawing attention from national organizations dedicated to police reform and racial justice. She became a voice for change, calm but unyielding, fierce yet compassionate. Jasmine's community forums evolved into something more than just discussions. They became spaces where people could come together to heal. At one event, held in a packed auditorium, she invited an unlikely guest, Michael Dawson. Still serving his sentence, Michael appeared via video call, dressed in a simple prison uniform. His presence sparked murmurs among the crowd, some skeptical, others curious. When he spoke, his words carried weight. "I failed," he admitted, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But I'm learning. And if sharing my story helps even one person think twice before acting out of fear or bias, then maybe I can make up for what I've done." To Jasmine's surprise, the audience listened intently. Some clapped softly when he finished, while others sat quietly, reflecting on his words. It wasn't forgiveness. They weren't there yet, but it was progress. Afterward, a young woman approached Jasmine, tears streaming down her face. "My brother was killed by a cop," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone cared until tonight. Thank you." For Victor Langston, this new chapter brought unexpected redemption. Working alongside Jasmine rekindled a sense of purpose he thought he'd lost years ago. Together, they drafted proposals for policy changes, lobbied lawmakers, and partnered with grassroots organizations. Their relationship deepened, no longer defined by past mistakes, but by shared determination. One evening, as they reviewed documents at Jasmine's kitchen table, Victor looked up and smiled faintly. "You remind me of your dad sometimes," he said, "not just because of how stubborn you are, but because you never give up." Jasmine smirked, pretending to be annoyed, but inside, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Michael, too, found moments of peace behind bars. Letters from Zeus's new handler arrived regularly, filled with updates about the dog's recovery. "He's doing well," one note read. "Still has trust issues, but he's learning to play again." Encouraged by these reports, Michael wrote back, pouring his heart into each letter. He also mentored fellow inmates, teaching them skills to rebuild their lives upon release. Though confined physically, he felt freer emotionally than he had in years. Outside the walls of the prison, society slowly began to shift. The reforms implemented in Michael's former precinct inspired similar initiatives across the country. Activists celebrated incremental victories. A ban on chokeholds here, mandatory body cameras there. None of it erased the systemic flaws entirely, but it proved that change, however slow, was possible. One sunny afternoon, Jasmine visited the park where her father used to take her as a child. Sitting on a bench overlooking the playground, she pulled out his army cap and held it close. "This isn't over," she whispered, as if speaking directly to him. "But we're getting closer." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above her, and for a moment, she felt his presence, a quiet reassurance that he was proud of the woman she'd become. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jasmine allowed herself a rare smile. The road ahead would be long, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but she knew she wasn't alone. With Victor by her side, allies in the fight for justice, and even Michael working toward redemption, she believed real change was within reach. In the end, it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where tragedies like her father's death wouldn't happen again. And though the journey was far from over, hope lingered in the air, reminding everyone that even the smallest steps forward mattered.